What's happening, everybody? So in this video, what I wanted to talk to you about is the truth behind some of the modifications that I get asked about quite a bit. Typically, those modifications run the lines of cold air kit, throttle bodies, intake manifolds, whether it's porting or aftermarket. Then it gets into tuning, camshafts, maybe forced induction. So what I want to do is I want to talk to you guys a little bit about this and maybe stave off you guys wasting your money on upgrades that you don't necessarily need. And in some cases, save you for some headaches you certainly don't want. So let's dive into this. First of all, cold air intakes. No, don't. Let me tell you guys something. One of the funniest things that I would typically get a question about would be one of these cheap cold air intakes that basically it's a tube with a filter. And the funny thing about it is they'll say, well, so-and-so manufacturer claims that they picked up, I don't know, pick a number that sounds big, amount of horsepower on a dyno. Guys, look, a tube going to an open filter underneath the hood of your car is going to do nothing but soak up under hood heat. There is no cold air in that. As a matter of fact, it's more of a hot air intake, and I've seen cars get slower at the drag strip by using those types of kits. But they want to quote horsepower numbers from the manufacturer as though it's scripture, which is hysterical to me. These companies are in business to make money off of your ignorance. And the guys that would just keep telling me, well, so-and-so picked up X amount of... Guys, you don't drive your cars on a dyno, okay? It's easy to pick a number out of the blue when you are manipulating dyno numbers or when you've got a part that is being exposed to nothing but super fresh cold air. Yeah, in that respect, there could be a small increase, but the reality is that in most cases, I have never seen them get any faster. Matter of fact, talking about most cases, they get slower. Best bet is to get a reusable filter for your stock air box. Remember to clean it properly, regularly, and that will be the best way to go. Don't get the dry filter. They flow worse than your stock paper filter. And if nothing else, get you a Hellcat air filter and a Hellcat air box. It's a cheap upgrade and it's the best of any of the, well, if you want to call it an aftermarket modification, even though it's a stock part, it's the best of all of them. So what about throttle bodies? Well, no. Here's the thing. The throttle body is not going to make up for any inadequacies in the intake manifold itself. And for the most part, an 80 millimeter throttle body for your Gen 3 Hemi is going to flow plenty of air. It's the rest of the system that has a bit of a problem. So getting that air through the engine and then out the exhaust is really more the issue than anything that has to do with the intake. But a larger throttle body will give you better throttle response, mainly because it is a larger hole tipping open the same amount, gets more volume of air. It's a neat little mod if that's what you're going for, but don't expect it to pick up any power. By the way, no tuning is needed for either of the two things that I've just talked about before. Now, what about intake manifolds themselves? Well, look into the throttle body argument already for part of the answer to that, but the reality is that an intake manifold isn't going to do any good, again, if you can't get the exhaust out. And in the case of the 5.7s, they have log manifolds for the exhaust, which are awful. So any kind of an upgrade there, whether it's shorty headers, long tubes, whatever the case is going to be, is going to help that argument along. But if you're just talking about a stock car, stick with the stock intake manifold. And by the way, it does a pretty decent job on its own. For you guys with 5.7 cars, that 5.7 intake that you've got flows about the same as a 6.1 intake manifold, that aluminum one that looks so pretty. It flows about like that one does. So not a huge gain to go to that intake manifold. Now, what about porting the intake manifold? Well, this is incredibly car by car specific. I've seen some 5.7 intake manifolds that look beautiful. I've seen some 6.4 intake manifolds that are pristine. And then I've seen everything in the middle leading right up to disgusting in terms of casting flash and just inclusions and seam misalignment inside of them. So each car is a little bit different. Now, how much can you look to pick up from porting the manifold? And when I say porting, that's a real loose statement. It's really more like blueprinting the manifold. Maybe 4, 3, 2 horsepower, but you're going to be down the car because obviously you can't drive the thing around while the intake manifold's off. And also don't forget to follow the torque sequence and make sure that you don't over torque that intake manifold for fear that you strip the threads out of the cylinder heads. Ask me how I know. So guys, don't look for huge gains on the top end of the engine. They're just not going to happen. And if you do anything on the top end of your engine, whether it's a 5.7 or a 6.4, make sure that you're complementing it further downstream. Well, the 6.4 to a lesser extent because it's got a really good exhaust system from the factory, but you 5.7 guys, man, y'all got the wrong end of the stick on this. Invest your money in the exhaust side of a 5.7 and you'll be in a lot better shape. If you've got a 6.4, stick with the Hellcat airbox and the Hellcat filter, you'll be fine. Now, what about tuning? Well, tuning is a little bit of a different story. The problem with tuning is that you've got to be teamed up with the right tuner, and you really need to have all of your hardware, in other words, your hard parts in line and on the car before you get the thing tuned. You don't want to keep going back, forth, and whatever. This is where having a plan really does work out. But if you've got long tubes on the way, a different cat back, you got maybe a larger throttle body because you like the snappiness or whatever, and your Hellcat airbox and Hellcat filter, then a tune is going to do pretty well for you. You'll pick up a decent amount of power, but the main thing is going to be in the transmission tune. There's some torque management things that can be changed around that'll make the car a lot more peppy. But in terms of making more outright power, well, again, this is one of those scenarios where don't come into this thing looking for huge gains. 10 to 15 horsepower is about the most you can reliably hope for on pump gas, and that's on premium pump gas too, to really get you to a final number. And by the way, that horsepower number is the same for 5.7s and 6.4s. The 5.7s will pick up more of a percentage of their base power, mainly because they're coming into this world running off of 89 octane, really 87, but you get the idea as far as what the base tune is going to allow for. So that'll get you through your electronics, your headers, your intake manifolds, and everything else. Your basic FBO, your full bolt-on combination. You might pick up as much as 25. You'll have some nice chunks of torque here and there that are going to be gained with long tubes, things like that. Expect all of that before about 4,000 RPM though. Drivability will be nice, and that's really what you're going for. But let's say you want a bit more theater and you've decided to go with camshaft. Guys, camshafts are really weird to talk about because everybody's got their own flavor. Everybody's got their own level of acceptance when it comes to how much you can tolerate when it comes to choppiness, surginess, if you will. There's a lot that can go wrong when you're installing a camshaft in terms of the outcome. In other words, you can put too big of a cam in the car and the car is a dog to drive. Now you've got a mismatched combination that just doesn't do well at launch. In other words, at takeoff, partial throttle is soft, and if it ever did make any more horsepower, you'd only know it if you revved the thing to the moon. That's not a good street car. And typically the guys that fall under the radar of go to the bottom of the page and find the biggest camshaft are the ones that just don't know enough about just the whole car scene in general. They just want all the chibbity chop chop. But with that is not necessarily going to come more performance. So the idea here is to find camshafts, or at least camshaft manufacturers, that will offer you something along the lines of a stage 2. And by the way, throwing stage numbers out there for you guys is, for me, like throwing cats on a chalkboard. It's just, but you've got to have a reference point. And without getting too mired into stage 1 versus 2, 3, and all this other stuff and what it means, stick with a stage 2. The reason why is typically a stage 2 cam is more of a street cam than anything else. It's a street plus improved profile that'll get you a bit of a sound and a bit of a horsepower bump, but it's not going to sacrifice a crazy amount of street ability and make the car a nightmare to live with. Now, if you're going to go the camshaft route, keep in mind that everything I said before the camshaft is going to have to be done to that car. Long tube headers, any intake goofiness or anything like that that you want to do, you want to have that done. But the long tube headers are a must for a camshaft. You've got to have that scavenging effect going through the exhaust. Without it, your camshaft will absolutely not work the way that it's supposed to. So Stick with the Stage 2. It will save you so many headaches as far as drivability issues, provided your tuner knows what he's doing. But it'll save you a ton of drivability issues. It'll also save you the need to have to get, a torque converter and all this other nonsense, all the racy race parts that only matter to like nobody, 0.0% of the population. They're not going to make the car any faster on the street, and it's not going to add to the driving experience of the car at all. Matter of fact, it'll take away from it. It'll make it feel soft under partial throttle, which, by the way, the calling card of these Hemis is that they're snappy under partial throttle. You start putting big nasty cams in these cars and you start taking that aspect of the car away, you will wreck a major part of the allure and the fun factor of the V8 Hemi that you got, right? So now, having said all of that, let's talk about forced induction. Guys, this is the most expensive. It gets the most likes. It's the thing that people want to hear about the most, right? Boost is the big deal. Guys, look, stay away from a Pro Charger. I'll just say that straight away. And the reason why I'm saying that is because if you've got a 5.7, there's no reason to go Pro Charger. The only place you're going to really pick up a nice chunk of power is going to be at the very top part of the RPM range. And by the way, when I say Pro Charger, I'm talking about centrifugal supercharger. This could be Paxton, Vortec, or whoever's making superchargers these days. Torque Storm. The idea here, though, really is to stick with a supercharger kit that's clean looking, that looks factory and gives you power everywhere. That's going to be a positive displacement style supercharger, whether it's the E-Force supercharger kit from Edelbrock or a Whipple or a Magnuson, something along those lines. A mild positive displacement supercharger is always going to be way more fun to drive than a centrifugal supercharged combination, because you can enjoy the boost all the time with a positive displacement supercharger. A centrifugal supercharger under partial throttle conditions feels like a stock car. So you've spent all of that money to only enjoy it at watt, where a positive displacement, you can play with it all the time. Power is always there. It's why manufacturers, if they're going to go supercharged, always gravitate towards those positive displacement supercharger combinations. They're much more of a rich driving experience. By the way, turbos, I'm not even going to talk about that because the price becomes astronomical, packaging becomes a nightmare, and let's be real, who's going to go turbocharger when a clean Magnuson style supercharger, for example, will give you 99% of the performance envelope without any of the headaches. So, to recap, guys, think through the combination that you're going to put together before you start spending money. I'm hoping that this video helped you along, saved you some money, or at least gave you another way to take a look at the project that you're working on. And with that, that's a wrap. Post up your comments. Adios.